I'll start off by saying that I am a 21-year-old male from upstate New York. When I returned home from college for summer break last year, my parents informed me that they would be visiting relatives in Edmonton, Canada during the second week of July. I wanted to go with them, but they told me that they made the plans at the last minute, and the plane tickets were quite expensive at the time. Therefore, I would need to stay in the house by myself while they were away. Although I was disappointed about not going to Canada, I was quite content with having the house to myself. I spent most of the time watching television, playing video games, and hanging out with friends. I returned home from a friend's house late one night. After pulling into my driveway, I decided to smoke a cigarette outside and maybe take a short walk around the neighborhood before going back into my house. I walked down to the end of my driveway and started smoking. I quickly noticed that several lights were on upstairs. I found this odd as I distinctly remember that none of the lights were on when I left earlier in the evening. As I looked up at the upstairs windows outside my house, I saw a shadow, which appeared to be moving in my parents' bedroom. It was clear that someone was in my house. My heart started racing and I started panicking. I immediately dialed 911 and told the operator that there was an intruder in my house. The operator gathered all my information and told me to stay calm as help was on the way. I kept my eyes locked on the moving shadow. I felt quite relieved once two cop cars arrived at my house. I greeted them and told them what I saw in the window. When I looked up again, I could clearly see a man staring directly at me from my parents' room. I alerted the officer, who was also able to see the man in the window. Two armed police officers entered my house and I immediately called my parents. Once I got off the phone with them, both officers walked out of my house with a man in handcuffs. He appeared to be in his late 30s and was dressed like a typical burglar in all black. I saw him glaring at me as the cops escorted him to the police car. I was too scared to go back to my house alone once the cops had left, so I went and crashed at my friend's place until my parents returned home. After my parents returned home, they immediately installed a home security system. I don't know what happened after the man was arrested. However, I later learned that the police found that the man brought a crowbar, some rope, and a knife when he broke in. I can't imagine what could have happened to me if I decided to go inside my house after returning home that fateful night. So in 2009, when I was 19 years old, I traveled from the US to Sydney, Australia to visit my then girlfriend. We met while she was on a work visa in San Pedro, California. While I was there for 2 months, I would be staying with her at her parents' home. She lived in a middle-class suburban neighborhood. I was there during the summer, so it can be extremely hot, even at nighttime. I usually would sleep with her in her bedroom, but on this particular one hot night, I chose to sleep out in the open area where there was a spare bed underneath a ceiling fan. Her bedroom was upstairs and her parents' was downstairs. Upstairs, it was her bedroom, a long hallway and a big open area with a bed, sofa, TV, and a patio with a balcony overlooking the backyard. So this night when I chose to sleep in the large, open area, I was so tired I just laid there on the bed underneath the fan with no blankets on. I must have fell asleep instantly. Around 4 a.m., I opened my eyes to the patio door on the balcony being slightly open. It was strange because I know for a fact that it was closed when I fell asleep. I started to panic. I laid still, and about 10 seconds later, I heard a commotion downstairs. The bed I was on was about 5 feet away from the stairs leading downstairs. I noticed the light was on in the stairway. It was a sensor light, so when anyone walked downstairs, the light would automatically go on. I quietly sat up and looked around. I noticed the drawer at the end of the bed was open. It was about 2 feet away from my head. I must not have heard it. I also noticed my shower towel that I hung on the stair railing was missing. About 30 seconds later, I heard my girlfriend's father coming up the stairs. We went and checked on my girlfriend's room. She was sleeping normally. We woke her up. Her father explained he heard someone in the kitchen and assumed it was one of us. He called out our names, and when no one replied, he got out of bed to check who it was. At that moment, there was an intruder that took off outside the patio door downstairs alongside of the house and ran into the night. We turned on all the lights in the house and called the police. While looking around to see if anything of mine was stolen, I noticed my passport, cash, wallet, and bag were stolen. I called to cancel all of my bank cards. Right on the little table by the bed, I had some loose cash on it. It would have been clear to someone standing on the balcony. Apparently what happened was some man in the night climbed up the balcony to the second floor. Once he made his way onto the balcony, he would have seen me sleeping in a large open room with the light on. He decided to break in anyway. The police later said that I was lucky I didn't wake up since he clearly seen me sleeping there and decided to break in anyway. They said he would have been prepared with a weapon to use it in case I woke up. The crazy part is, I am a very light sleeper, but for some reason this night I did not wake up to a man rummaging through my belongings just a couple feet away in a bright open room. I must have woke up just seconds after he made his way down the stairs. The police said the reason he would have taken my towel was to put over his hand in case he had to break any windows to escape. Nothing else of value was missing in the house. A few weeks later, the police called and said my bag was found in a small river, that I could come pick it up from the station. Of course, anything of value was gone. I don't think the police ever caught the guy. It still creeps me out thinking what could have happened if I woke up seconds earlier. So right when I was fresh out of college, I managed to land myself a job with an engineering firm over in Pennsylvania. It kind of sucked having to move away from Rochester, New York, where all my friends and family were, but the salary this firm was offering was so sweet I just couldn't turn it down. So I went online and got looking for apartments just outside of Philly, eventually finding an advert from a guy who was looking for a roommate for his super swanky apartment. I mean, this place was really nice, and I could get why the guy would be looking for a roommate to split the rent with, especially since he seemed to be a younger dude who was probably in a similar position as I was. However, I didn't have the time to drive down to actually look at the place or meet the guy in person, so I pretty much did all the arrangements by phone, which maybe, now that I look back on it, was my first big mistake. So I move in with this guy Daryl, who was super chill and pretty much spent all day playing 2K since he worked nights. I figured must have had a pretty high-paying job since he had this huge flat-screen TV, lots of expensive clothes, a nice car, the works. We didn't talk all that much since we were on such different schedules, but eventually, when I asked him exactly what it was that he did for a living, he gave some super vague answer about having some kind of accountancy job. And no matter how much I pressed him for details, he always gave some wishy-washy answer until he got tired of the questions and changed the subject. Like a lot of you reading this, I started to suspect that Daryl wasn't quite telling the truth about what he did for a living. Like not once did I see him wearing anything like a shirt and tie. All his clothes were super upmarket, sure, but they were all super casual. He also had a lot of visitors in the evenings before we left for work. At first I figured they were just friends of his, but there were a handful he didn't seem all that close with, and every time they stopped by to see him, at some point they'd just scuttle off into Daryl's bedroom for a while, talking in hushed tones before the visitor eventually left. I knew something was going on, but as embarrassing as it is, back then I was pretty naive, and besides that, I really didn't think it was any of my business. The last thing I wanted to do was upset my new roommate and piss away such a sweet living arrangement. So, this one Saturday, I'm in the local 7-Eleven, just like a block away from the apartment, when this dude comes up to me as I'm looking at coffee and asks me if I'm the guy who lives with Daryl. Obviously, I'm all like, yeah, good to see you, dude. I didn't recognize the guy, but I figured he'd visited the apartment one time and I just couldn't quite remember his face. He's being all friendly and whatnot, making small talk about this and that, before he asks if I know whether or not Daryl was home right then. I told him I didn't know, but that since it was like mid-afternoon that he probably was, since he worked nights, whatever that entailed. The guy is all like, okay, cool, I might stop by and say hi and all this stuff, then makes some excuse and leaves the store. I pick up a few things and head back to the apartment, half expecting to see the guy from the 7-Eleven when I walk through the door. Only he's not there, and when I tell Daryl about how I saw one of his buddies in the store, he has no idea who I'm talking about. Even when I describe the guy in quite vivid detail, he has absolutely zero clue who I'm referring to. He starts reeling off names, asking if it was Deshaun or Robbie or Angelo, and it's then I sort of realized that the guy hadn't given me a name at all, which is weird, right? I mean, I thought it was, you think the dude would have been like, tell him such and such said hi, or at least something like that. I didn't really think anything of it at the time, but Daryl seemed just a little too freaked out by the encounter for my liking. And in the moments after I told him, he marches off into his bedroom and stays there for the rest of the evening, talking to someone I'm guessing on the phone, in those same hushed tones that I was used to hearing. A few days after this, I'm walking back up towards the 7-Eleven to grab some milk for coffee, when I see the same dude that hadn't given his name, parked up at the side of the road. He calls out to me, greeting me and making chit-chat in that same warm way he had before again asking if Daryl was home. This time I straight up lied to him, telling him that yeah, Daryl was home. Only this time he was with a bunch of his friends playing 2K. He wasn't. He was actually out visiting family across the city, but there was something about this guy that I really didn't like. I quickly make an excuse, telling him I had to go, and it was only then that this guy's demeanor started to change. He wasn't all smiles and laughs anymore. He just eyeballed me as I walked away, and he was still there when I walked back, just watching me as I walked towards our apartment. I should have seen it coming, and I feel like such a dumbass for not knowing what I was headed for. But I guess hindsight is always 20/20, because a couple of nights later, I'm just about to catch some sleep when Daryl finally comes home from work. He seems a little shaken and asks me if anyone has called by the apartment that evening. I tell him no, it's been pretty quiet, but the answer doesn't satisfy him. He asks me if I've seen anyone at all, anyone hanging around the area that I didn't recognize. I'd already told him about the second encounter I'd had with the 7-Eleven guy, and this time it had creeped him out even more. He asked if I'd seen that same guy at any point that evening, and I told him no, that I hadn't seen him since that weekday evening. I turned the whole thing around and asked him what he was so nervous about, if anything had happened at work that evening. But he was his usual cagey self. He just retreated to his bedroom, where he apparently went straight to sleep, which is exactly what I did too. Next thing I know, I'm waking up to this loud banging on the front door to our apartment. I pretty much knew exactly what the deal was. Daryl had gone out to make a call, as he sometimes did at this time of night, and had left his keys in the apartment. This had happened a handful of times before, and I was honestly getting really sick of being woken up by it. I'd suggested he actually put his car keys and apartment keys on the same key ring, but nope, apparently that meant if he lost one set, he lost both, which maybe was quite a smart idea in the long run, but that's beside the point. So I'm all bleary-eyed, shuffling towards the front door in my underwear and a t-shirt, when he starts banging again. I'm all like, all right, I'm coming. Stop it with the banging, Jesus. Before I undo the deadbolts and open up the door, I start saying something like, you really should just attach those goddamn keys, when I see it's not Daryl at all. In fact, I have no idea who the guy at the door is because he's wearing a goddamn ski mask, and I have absolutely time or will to ask him and the two other assholes he was with. Because as soon as I open the door, he points a gun in my face, and then frog marches me back inside the apartment before locking the door behind them. The ski mask guy makes me kneel on the floor in the TV room and whispers to me that if I shout or anything, he's going to blow my brains out. I was absolutely terrified. I mean, more scared than I've ever been in my entire life. I had these uncontrollable shakes, like I had trouble just holding my head up. It was more comfortable for me to just rest my chin against my chest and pray that it'd all be over soon. This had a dual purpose, too, because the last thing I saw before I did so and shut my eyes tight was one of the guys placing an empty plastic bottle of the muzzle of his pistol. Naive over somethings I was, yes, but I knew enough to know that this was some kind of ad hoc way to silence a shot. I didn't want to see what happened next, and I'm glad I didn't, because they burst into Daryl's room, and I heard the pop of that pistol as they shot him. I thought he was dead for a few minutes, like I was convinced they'd just straight up executed him right there in his bed. That was until they dragged him out of the bedroom, bleeding and cursing, and threw him down on the TV room floor, a few meters away from me. The one guy kept his gun to the back of my head while they pretty much tortured Daryl right there in the TV room. One guy stamped on the bullet wound he had, leaning on it with his sneaker while the other forced his face into a couch cushion to muffle the screams. I mean, it was all obviously horrible what they were doing, and that was disturbing enough. But what really got to me was how they seemed to enjoy the whole thing. How they seemed to take an immense amount of personal pleasure in causing us both as much pain and distress as was physically possible. It was like hearing Daryl's cries of pain was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. How the sight of his blood was the most fascinating, satisfying thing they'd ever seen. And it was then that it all came out. Like I said, you might guessed what the deal was by now, but I pretty much had no idea back then. I was just young and dumb. Daryl was a drug dealer, and this was a robbery. So they beat the hell out of him until he finally spoke up and told them where he kept his money and his stash. But I mean, for a while there, I thought they might have gotten the wrong place. Daryl flat out denied knowing what the hell they were talking about and insisted they'd gotten the wrong place and how there was nothing to find here. But in the end, he broke and told them. They then took to clearing him out, and from what he told me after he'd been discharged from the hospital for a fairly superficial gunshot wound to the shoulder, they'd taken him for about $20,000 plus. I had to cover Daryl's rent for a few months until he was well enough to get himself a real job. Turns out he was an actual college graduate with a business degree and was dealing in college to make a little money. When he graduated, the money came too easy that he just didn't bother to get a legit job. He wasn't a gangster, he just didn't have that kind of personality, which I suppose is what made him the perfect prey for the actual criminals that broke in that night. We got over what happened eventually, but obviously Daryl still has this big old scar on his shoulder. A reminder of one of the worst nights of our lives, one that'll always be with us, no matter where we go, or what we do, or who we become.
Thanks for watching, and if you have a story you would like to be told, then please go to r/paranormal_side to submit your story.